Hey everyone, welcome back to Lecture 5.1, the Cold War, Origins to 1960. Today we're going to talk about the Eisenhower administration and kind of continue talking about the Cold War. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower would be the man Americans would associate with the 1950s. He was president from 1953 to 1961. Eisenhower was born in Texas, but he grew up in Abilene, Kansas. He graduated from West Point in 1915. He did not see action in World War I, but in the 1920s he did serve in Panama. Later, Eisenhower attended the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. There he finished first in his class of 275 other students. Later, Eisenhower served under MacArthur both in Washington from 1930 to 1935 and then in the Philippines from 1936 to 1939. In World War II, as we've already seen, he was sent to Europe to be the Supreme Allied Commander, and he was successful in defeating the Germans in World War II. After the war, he served as Army Chief of Staff, later President of Colombia, and then he was commander of NATO forces in Europe, and that's when he decides to run for president. Now, Eisenhower was in Europe serving as NATO commander, and he was pressured into running for president. Maybe not pressured, but pressed by others. He had been sought as a presidential candidate in 1948 to run. Both Democrats and Republicans had wanted him to run for their respective parties in 1948, but he declined to do it then. In 1952, men such as General Lucius D. Clay from the Berlin Blockade, Berlin Airlift, and Thomas Dewey, they pushed Eisenhower to run. Dewey told him that, quote, he could save the country from going to Hades in the handbasket of paternalism and socialism dictatorship. It must be remembered that the Republicans haven't controlled the presidency for 20 years, and they were also out of power in Congress for most of those 20 years. Many people thought that America was becoming a one-party state, the Democrat Party, since they had been so successful in the 1930s and 40s, and Eisenhower really believed that it was healthy to have a two-party system, so that's one reason he thinks a Republican needs to win, is we need to break up this Democrat control that's been over Washington for the last 20 years. Now, Ike did have opponents on the Republican side. In the Republican primary, his main opponent was Robert A. Taft. That was the son of former President William Howard Taft. Robert Taft was a senator from Ohio. He was nicknamed Mr. Republican, and he was a very small government, isolationist type of Republican, a Republican from the Midwest. Let's go back to the way things were before the New Deal. Let's dismantle some of the New Deal. Let's not get involved in Europe's affairs. Eisenhower is a more moderate Republican. Let's not get rid of the New Deal, but let's kind of manage it better than FDR and Truman did. Let's not go as far as some of the programs did, but Eisenhower is an internationalist. He does believe America needs to play a role on the international stage. So basically, there's this split within the Republican Party between the conservative wing, which is the Midwestern wing. They want to roll back the New Deal, and the more moderate Eastern wing, which didn't necessarily want to roll back the New Deal, just run it more efficiently, like I said. They're also the internationalist wing of the Republican Party. Now, Eisenhower defeats Taft for the nomination. For vice president, he picks Richard Nixon. Nixon's the young, energetic, anti-communist Republican from California, so he's Eisenhower's running mate. Eisenhower ran against Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. The Republicans made the campaign about three things: corruption, communism, and Korea. This is the famous C2K formula. Now, Nixon went on the offensive during the campaign. He labeled his opponent, him and Eisenhower's opponent, as Adlai the Appeaser, saying that he had, quote, a PhD from Dean Acheson's Cowardly College of Communist Containment. So there's a lot of criticism of the way Truman and his officials are conducting the Cold War. Nixon reminded voters that the nation would be better off with, quote, khaki-clad president than one clothed in State Department pinks. The State Department was often criticized by Republicans as being soft on communism. Now, there was a moment of scandal involving Nixon. It was reported that he had a private political fund of about $16,000. It really wasn't all that scandalous. Adlai Stevenson, the Democrat candidate, also had a fund for the similar purposes, but Eisenhower was running on the issue of corruption, and he didn't want even a whiff of it in his campaign. He did think about having Nixon step down as the vice presidential nominee, but Nixon gave this famous televised address, which came to be known as the Checkers speech, in which he defended himself, and after the speech, Eisenhower decided to keep him. It was called the Checkers speech because one of the contributions Nixon had accepted was a dog named Checkers. He said that his kids liked the dog, so they were going to keep it. I've got a little video clip here of you can watch Nixon give part of his speech.
One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. But just let me say this last word. Regardless of what happens, I'm going to continue this fight. I'm going to campaign up and down in America until we drive the crooks and the communists and those that defend them out of Washington. And remember, folks, Eisenhower is a great man, believe me. He's a great man. And a vote for Eisenhower is a vote for what's good for America. The Republican Senator.
Now, one new aspect of presidential campaigning was something called the TV spot. The Eisenhower campaign filmed Eisenhower giving short answers to questions or making simple statements that would appeal to voters. And I want you to watch some of these here, so here are some clips.
The man from Abilene, out of the heartland of America, out of this small frame house in Abilene, Kansas, came a man, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Through the crucial hour of historic D-Day, he brought us to the triumphant peace of VE Day. Now another crucial hour in our history. The big question.
General, if war comes, is this country really ready?
It is not. The administration has spent many billions of dollars for national defense. Yet today, we haven't enough tanks for the fighting in Korea. It is time for a change.
The nation, haunted by the stalemate in Korea, looks to Eisenhower. Eisenhower knows how to deal with the Russians. He has met Europe's leaders, has got them working with us. Elect the number one man for the number one job of our time. November 4th, vote for peace. Vote for Eisenhower. A paid film.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John
or Dean
or Harry,
let's do that big job right. Just get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president.
Now, Eisenhower is kind of later in the 1960s criticized as kind of an old grandpa type president who doesn't really understand the times. He's kind of old-fashioned. But as these TV spots show, Eisenhower really understood, or at least his campaign handlers understood, the importance of TV in the 1952 election. These TV spots angered the Stevenson campaign because they thought it was insulting to reduce complicated policy stances down to short sound bites. Stevenson criticized these TV spots by saying, "I think the American people will be shocked by such contempt for their intelligence. This isn't Ivory Soap versus Palmolive." One thing that cemented the election for Eisenhower was the promise he made in 1952. In October of that year, just before the election, he promised that if he was elected, he would go to Korea and try to see what he could do about ending the war. Americans are getting tired of the war. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Truman seems like he's willing to settle for a stalemate, not total victory. And this promise is enough for most Americans. They thought, hey, if anyone can go to Korea and fix the situation, it's America's most famous general, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower ends up winning a huge landslide. He receives 33.9 million votes to Stevenson's 27.3 million. He wins the Electoral College 442 to 89. He even cracked the Solid South, which almost always votes for the Democrats because the Democrats are the party of Jim Crow and segregation. The Republicans also won the House and the Senate. So the Republicans would be in control of the presidency and both chambers of Congress for the first time since 1930. So that's a big deal. That's over 20 years ago. Eisenhower did make good on his promise to go to Korea. He went to the front for 3 days in December of 1952, and then he spends the first 6 months of his administration working on ending the war. And the ceasefire that occurred in July 1953 was probably one of his greatest accomplishments. And we kind of talked about how the Korean War came to an end back when we studied Truman. Now, Eisenhower talked tough regarding the Cold War. In his inaugural address, he talked about how freedom was pitted against slavery, lightness was pitted against darkness. Eisenhower was a tough Cold Warrior, but he also knew that because he was viewed as a military man, he could do things diplomatically that others couldn't. He did accept Truman's foreign policy of containment, but he disliked how Truman had gotten America dragged into a land war in Asia. Eisenhower was determined to keep America out of wars like the Korean War. In January 1954, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, announced the policy of massive retaliation, so this is a big change from Truman. The United States had done well to contain communism with responses such as the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and the Korean War. But the United States could never match the manpower of the Red Army. The United States, Dulles said, should, quote, depend primarily upon a great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at places of our choosing. One of the problems with Truman is that he allowed the communists to take the initiative and pick where the fight for freedom would play out. So the communists picked Korea, and then Truman had to respond. Eisenhower wants to be the one taking the initiative, not just responding to crisis after crisis. Eisenhower's defense would also be different than that of Truman. Massive retaliation and NSC 162-2, that's a document from October 1953. These things emphasize the need for a nuclear-based strategy and for cost-cutting in defense spending. This policy would dictate that Eisenhower would rely on the threat of nuclear weapons to kind of win or keep the peace in the Cold War. Contemporaries called this the New Look. The willingness to use nuclear weapons in nuclear war was a great way to keep your enemies guessing, kind of Eisenhower thought. Threatening the use of nuclear weapons in a crisis was known as brinksmanship. Basically, we're willing to go to the brink of nuclear war to show your enemies that you were serious. So because Eisenhower's a military general, threatening to use nuclear weapons carries more weight with the Chinese and the Soviets than maybe Truman would have, because Truman's not a military man. To kind of show this, Eisenhower was once quoted as saying, "In any combat, when these things can be used on strictly military targets for strictly military purposes, I can see no reason why they shouldn't be used just exactly as you would use a bullet or anything else." So, if you think about this, if you're Stalin, Stalin's dead, but if you're Khrushchev, the guy that replaces Stalin, or if you're Mao in China, here's the American hero from World War II who says nuclear weapons are just like a bullet. You might want to believe him, so that's kind of what Eisenhower does. Now, Eisenhower was also determined to keep defense costs down, and nuclear weapons were a great way to do that. It's much easier to build a nuclear weapon than it is to have a huge army. Think about if you needed to take out, like, think about World War II. How much money it would cost to invade Japan, the home islands, millions and millions of dollars, millions of lives. But think about the atomic bomb. The whole Manhattan Project cost $2 billion, and it ended the war very quickly, so nuclear weapons are cheaper. Eisenhower was worried about high levels of defense spending. He also worried about something he called the garrison state. He famously said in 1953 that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. So in a way, Eisenhower, the military man, wants to keep the defense spending down, and he wants to guard against the military becoming too powerful and too much of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Too much of a, not a threat, but influence on American society. Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense Charles E. Wilson said that nuclear weapons provided, quote, a bigger bang for the buck, and that's kind of how nuclear weapons are thought of in the Eisenhower administration. So as a result of this, defense spending decreases during his administration. It decreased from $50 billion in 1953 to $40 billion in 1956. Now it does creep up to $46 billion in 1959, but overall he keeps costs down. Eisenhower would rely on the massive retaliatory power and cheap costs of nuclear weapons to contain communism. The United States tested at least 203 nuclear weapons in the Pacific and in Nevada between 1946 and 1961. Here are some unforgettable photos of nuclear testing in Nevada. This first picture shows the soldiers of the 11th Airborne Division watching an atomic explosion near Las Vegas in 1951. This was the first ever deployment of troops and maneuvers involving nuclear weapons. Just in case they have to be used on the battlefield, can troops still maneuver around them? This next picture is from a nuclear test done in 1952. Citizens in Las Vegas observe a mushroom cloud in the distance, which is kind of interesting, just thinking about standing on the streets of Las Vegas and watching an atomic explosion go off. Now, to make massive retaliation a reality, the United States in the 1950s was developing better planes, such as the jet-propelled B-47, to deliver these nuclear weapons. By 1955, the United States had some 400 B-47s, plus another 1,350 planes that could drop nuclear weapons. Massive retaliation would allow the United States to counter the large ground forces of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower also knew that the future lay in missile-delivered nuclear weapons. During his administration in the 1950s, Eisenhower supported research and development of the Atlas, Polaris, and Minuteman missile programs. James T. Patterson writes about all this, and he says, quote, in supporting massive retaliation, Eisenhower and Dulles adopted historically familiar American approaches to defense, faith in high technology, and aversion to large standing armies in time of peace. These were politically attractive approaches. Now, another way that Eisenhower differs from Truman was that in the use of covert operations during the Cold War. Eisenhower would set a major precedent in American foreign policy, and not necessarily a good one. In his use of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA was run by Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles' younger brother. It was a relatively small agency in the late 1940s, but in the 1950s, it grew to have a budget of over $82 million and almost 6,000 personnel, both in the United States and overseas. Eisenhower used the CIA to oust Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. And then in 1954, the CIA intervened in Guatemala to overthrow Colonel Jacob Arbenz Guzman. So Eisenhower does use the CIA to install governments that are friendly towards anti-communist causes. Now, Eisenhower faces a number of threats or crises throughout his first term in office. There were 4 in particular that he had to deal with. These crises were initiated sometimes by allies of the United States and sometimes by the enemies of the United States. These crises took place in Vietnam, the Straits of Formosa, the Suez, and Hungary. Now, let's look at Vietnam first. During World War II, the Japanese occupied French Indochina. After the defeat of Japan, the French wanted to regain their colonies, but the Vietnamese wanted their independence. So in September 1945, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese nationalists, declared Vietnamese independence in Hanoi. His independence message borrowed from the American Declaration of Independence. He quoted, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The Star-Spangled Banner played during the Vietnamese independence proclamation. American warplanes flew over to celebrate Vietnamese independence. There were Americans on the ground celebrating independence. So basically you have this really strange thing happen in 1945 where it seems like Ho Chi Minh and the United States are getting along. In 20 years they're going to be fighting the Vietnam War against each other. So it's kind of a weird start. But despite all of this, the French still want their colony back, and they go to war to get it. So from 1946 to 1954, you have something called the First Indochina War, or kind of the French-Vietnamese War. This put the United States in a tough position. On the one hand, the United States is against colonialism. The Atlantic Charter that FDR issued with Churchill during the war talked about how colonialism needs to end. So the United States does see the validity of Vietnamese independence, but on the other hand, in addition to being a nationalist, Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and the United States did not want to see colonialism supplanted by communism. And basically, America is more focused on Europe at this point than they are Asia. So to America in the Cold War, France is more important than Vietnam is. So in the end, because he wanted their help in Europe, and because Europe is a more vital area, Truman decided to support the French, and then Eisenhower continues that. In 1954, Eisenhower laid out what became known as the falling domino principle, or the domino theory. He said if a place like Vietnam falls to communism, so too would nearby nations such as Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, Indonesia, maybe Australia, maybe Japan. So if one place falls to communism, the others will as well. So after years of fighting, the showdown between the French and the Viet Minh, that's the Vietnamese communist, this showdown came in 1954 at a place called Dien Bien Phu. The French built a huge military base in a valley in the middle of nowhere, hoping to force a decisive battle. The Viet Minh were led by Ngo Nguyen Giap. He led his men up the mountains overlooking this French base at Dien Bien Phu. They took apart their artillery down to the bolts and nuts, carried them up over the other side of the mountain, and then reassembled them so that they're overlooking the French base. And then they proceed to shell with artillery attacks the French. They also attack with soldiers. Now the French knew they're going to be defeated. They come to Washington and they ask Eisenhower to basically rescue them. The United States was already paying for much of the French war in Vietnam, and now they want Eisenhower to use tactical nuclear weapons against the Vietnamese nationalists. Eisenhower refuses to do this. He tells the French, "You boys must be crazy. We can't use those awful things against Asians for the second time in less than 10 years. My God." That's what he told some of his advisors and the French who wanted to use tactical nukes against the Viet Minh. Now, after consulting with Congress, Eisenhower also refused to carry out airstrikes to save the French. Dien Bien Phu falls in May of 1954. The Geneva Conference, which was a talk between the Viet Minh and the French, that's already going on. And at this conference, after Dien Bien Phu falls, they decide to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. And this is in 1954. 2 years later, in 1956, unification elections are supposed to take place. And it's widely believed that Ho Chi Minh He'll win the elections in 1956. He's now the leader of North Vietnam, north of the 17th parallel. For a time, the leader in the south was the former Emperor Bao Dai, but he would be replaced by Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was a fiercely anti-communist Vietnamese nationalist. He was a Catholic. He had spent a lot of time in the United States working and being educated. So that's who the United States ends up backing. What would end up happening is that Diem, with the backing from the U.S., would refuse to take part in the 1956 elections, basically canceling them because he figured he would lose. This led Ho Chi Minh to pursue unification and the defeat of Diem through kind of violent means. This is what will lead to the Vietnam War, but we'll kind of talk about that later. After making a brief appearance at the Geneva Conference, Secretary of State Dulles went on a tour of Southeast Asia, and he put together the SEATO Treaty. That's the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. The signature nations included the U.S., Great Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Pakistan, Thailand. They all agreed to meet common danger in the region and to consult each other in a crisis. However, SEATO is much weaker than NATO. It does not have a standing army, and it requires consultation, not military action. The next major crisis Eisenhower faces was over the offshore islands between China and Taiwan, Taiwan or Formosa. The mainland was controlled by the communists, by Mao, while Taiwan, or the island of Formosa, was controlled by the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek. Now, when the nationalists fled the mainland, they occupied all these small islands that kind of lead to Taiwan. And two of these islands, Quemoy and Matsu, are where this crisis kind of occurs. Now, from 1949 to 1954, there was an uneasy truce. But in 1954, after provocations from Chiang, the Chinese start to shell the islands of Quemoy and Matsu. They fire artillery shells at these islands. Chiang threatens to attack the mainland. China threatens to liberate Taiwan. Basically, both sides threaten each other. Eisenhower searches for a way to defend Taiwan without starting World War III. Nobody wants to go to war over these tiny islands in the Strait of Formosa. That would be kind of a dumb way to start World War III, kind of reminiscent of World War I. What was that war really about? Eisenhower decides to bluff China. He makes them think that the United States would intervene and go to war over Quemoy and Matsu. It was during this crisis in March 1955 that Eisenhower made his comment that using nuclear weapons was just like using a bullet. He also talked the Senate into passing something called the Formosa Resolution. It authorized the president to employ the armed forces of the United States as he deems necessary for the specific purpose of securing and protecting Formosa against armed attack. So basically, Eisenhower gets this blank check from the Senate that says if you need to use the military, use it how you think best. It passed the Senate 83-3 and the House 410-3. In getting the assurance that Formosa would be protected, Chiang had to agree with Eisenhower not to attack the Chinese mainland without the approval of the United States. You know, the United States is worried that Chiang might start World War III on his own without the United States knowing, and then the United States has to defend him because he's kind of an ally. So this agreement gets rid of that possibility. In May 1955, the shelling of Quemoy and Matsu stopped. Now, one thing about that Formosa resolution, Eisenhower doesn't use it to start a huge war. It's just basically a threat. Later on, when we look at the Gulf of Tonkin resolution under LBJ, it's basically the same thing, but because LBJ is not a military man, he ends up using the military and starting the Vietnam War, whereas Eisenhower didn't use this to start a war, but LBJ does. So Eisenhower does kind of set a precedent of getting a blank check from the Senate to go to war or use American troops, but he refuses to use it. It's just a tactic, but then LBJ takes that kind of tactic and ends up turning it into reality. In 1958, there was another crisis involving Quemoy and Matsu. Chiang deploys 100,000 soldiers to the islands. The Chinese consider this a provocation. Is he going to invade us? They react again by shelling the islands. Eisenhower again handles the situation pretty well, and war is avoided. Now, the third crisis is in the Middle East. In 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser comes to power in Egypt. Now, he's an advocate of Arab nationalism, but it's up in the air whether he'll remain in the Western camp or end up in the Western camp or the Soviet camp. He seems to be open to receiving aid from both sides. Perhaps he might try to play off both sides against the other, and this is pretty smart from his perspective. You know, the United States and the Soviet Union want as many allies as possible, so sometimes these smaller countries in the Middle East or Africa play hard to get, or Asia. That way the superpowers kind of compete over their allegiance. The Americans had offered to provide aid to build the Aswan Dam, which would have built a closer relationship between the leader of Arab nationalism in the Middle East and the United States. But Secretary of State Dulles abruptly cancels the project, and Eisenhower okays this. As a result, in July of 1956, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal had been controlled by a British and French company. A lot of world commerce travels through the Suez Canal. So what follows is the British, the French, and the Israelis agree upon a plan. Israel is going to attack Egypt. They're going to invade the Sinai Peninsula and create a bunch of chaos. This will threaten the Suez Canal, threaten world commerce. This will then give the British and the French a pretext to invade. So the British and the French bomb military installations of Egypt. They send in troops to secure the Suez Canal. The Soviets threaten to intervene. It's a very tense time. Eisenhower's really angry with Great Britain and France. He had warned them not to use force in the Middle East. He supports a UN resolution aimed against the invasion, and this is one of the rare instances of the Cold War where the United States and the Soviet Union are on the same side at the UN during an international crisis. Eisenhower threatens to cut off aid to the British and the French if they don't withdraw from Egypt. Ultimately, everyone agrees to back off. There's a ceasefire and a withdrawal of Israeli forces, and the issue is kind of put to rest. The fourth crisis that Eisenhower deals with in his first administration is the one in Hungary. Now, we have to backtrack a little bit to kind of explain what happens. In March of 1953, Stalin dies. For a while, it's unclear who would emerge as the leader of the Soviet Union, but soon it's apparent that the new leader is Nikita Khrushchev. Eisenhower and Khrushchev did meet each other in Geneva in July of 1955. This was the first such meeting between the superpowers since Potsdam in 1945, so it's been 10 years. At the summit, Eisenhower proposed something called Open Skies. If you think about it, both the Soviet Union and the United States had been dragged into World War II through a surprise attack. So Eisenhower recommended that each side allow regular aerial inspections of military installations in both nations. So basically, neither side will be surprised by an attack from the other. This will kind of relax Cold War tensions. But Khrushchev rejects this proposal. He told Eisenhower that this was just an excuse to, quote, look into our bedrooms. Khrushchev kind of always had a funny way of saying things. Despite nothing concrete coming from this summit, it was kind of a chance for the Cold War to thaw. Later in February 1956, Khrushchev gives a really important speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. This speech in Moscow was called his de-Stalinization speech. In a shocking manner, Khrushchev attacks Stalin. He calls him a murderous tyrant. He said Stalin perpetrated show trials, terror, purges, forced labor, and mass executions on his own people. So Khrushchev wants a clean break with Stalin's reign of terror. Khrushchev says that the Soviet Union could coexist with the West. Now, this doesn't mean that Khrushchev is suddenly going to back down in the face of the West or attempts of reform in Eastern Europe. In October 1956, there's an uprising in Hungary. The Hungarians wanted pro-Soviet officials out of the country. Remember, the Soviet Union really influences Eastern Europe, but a lot of these Eastern European countries want to control their own destinies. So the Hungarians want pro-Soviet officials out. They also wanted Soviet troops withdrawn, and they wanted Hungary to exist from the Warsaw Pact. There was violence in the streets. Hungarian freedom fighters battled Soviet-backed communists. There's basically military actions going on in Budapest. So in November, Khrushchev sends in 200,000 Red Army troops and 4,000 tanks. He sends them into Budapest. Some 40,000 Hungarian freedom fighters are killed, and some 200,000 are forced to flee. Some people in the United States wanted Eisenhower to aid the Hungarian patriots. In fact, some people blamed Eisenhower for the rebellion in Hungary getting started. In 1952, the Eisenhower administration, as he's kind of running for president, they talk about liberating captive peoples. They talked about how Eastern Europe was considered a captive nation, captive area to Soviet communism. The United States broadcast the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe into Eastern Europe. Many thought that if they rebelled, the United States would come to their aid. So there are people in Eastern Europe that hear this promise from America to help liberate them. So that may have helped the Hungarians start their rebellion. But Eisenhower knew that there was no way to aid the rebels in Hungary. Eastern Europe is in the sphere of influence under the Soviet Union. He observed that Hungary was, quote, as inaccessible to us as Tibet. In the end, Eisenhower does nothing, and the rebellion in Hungary is crushed. Now, in the midst of this rebellion in Hungary, Eisenhower runs for re-election in 1956. Again, it's Eisenhower and Nixon running against Adlai Stevenson. He runs again as the Democrat. It was pretty certain that Eisenhower would win. In a Gallup poll in August of 1955, so a year before the election, Eisenhower's popularity rate is 79%. The columnist James Reston said, quote, "The popularity of President Eisenhower has got beyond the bounds of reasonable calculation and will have to be put down as a national phenomenon like baseball. The thing is no longer just a remarkable political fact, but a kind of national love affair." The Democrats did in 1956 run TV spots that were negative ads. Despite these, Eisenhower cruised to victory. He received almost 36 million votes to Stevenson's 26 million. The Electoral College vote was 457 to 73. Eisen even managed to get a majority of black votes in 10 northern and 12 southern cities. The Democrats did have success in keeping the House and the Senate. So Eisenhower is a very popular president, but the Democrat Party is still more popular than the Republican Party. Now, Eisenhower faces more challenges in his second term. One of the biggest fears of the American people in the later 1950s was that their nation was falling behind in the space race. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was the world's first orbiting satellite. It was the size of a beach ball, and it weighed just over 180 pounds. In November, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2. This weighed almost 1,200 pounds, and it carried scientific equipment. It also carried the dog Laika into space. In October 59, the Soviet landed a probe on the moon and sent back pictures. In April of 1961, they put the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. It was not until February 1962, into the Kennedy administration, that the United States put their first man into orbit, Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn. So basically, America is really worried about all the Soviet successes in the late 1950s in space. And in the late 1950s, the Americans are not having success. In December 1957, the Americans test the Vanguard missile system, but they were embarrassed when it took off and flew only a few feet off the ground and then crashed. The press referred to this test as Flopnik and Stay Putnik, so kind of mocking that the Americans can't get a rocket up into space like the Soviets. Democrats criticized Eisenhower over these failures. In November 1957, a month before this first failure of the Vanguard rockets, something called the Gaither Report was given to Eisenhower, and it was soon leaked to the press. It recommended huge increases in military spending and called for the building of fallout shelters. But Eisenhower basically refuses to get panicked by all the space race advances the Soviet Union is making. He knows that America is still superior in technology. More reports soon followed that came from experts detailing how the United States was falling behind the Soviet Union in the space race. In early 1958, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund released a number of critiques along this line. Now, these reports and the failures of American engineering and science led to a claim that under Eisenhower's leadership, a missile gap had been allowed to occur between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Democrats used this claim of a missile gap in the 1958 and 1960 elections, but there was no missile gap. The United States is not lacking in missiles. Some Democrats, such as John F. Kennedy, knew this. As he ran for president, he would get intelligence briefings and he would be told there is no missile gap, but he would publicly say that Eisenhower had allowed a missile gap to occur. Eisenhower knew that there was no missile gap because of these U-2 flights over Soviet territory, but he also knew, along with the Democrats, that he could not tell the nation this, because if he told the nation there's no missile gap, he would have to tell them why, and then he would tell them because we have military planes spying on the Soviet Union, and that would cause an international crisis. So basically, the Democrats and Eisenhower have to keep this a secret, and the Democrats use it against Eisenhower. This did make Eisenhower mad. Now, one important outcome of this space race scare was the creation of NASA in 1958. So Eisenhower pushes for the creation of NASA. And then the passage of the National Defense Education Act. In a historic break, the federal government became directly involved in education, which was then strictly a local affair. The National Defense Education Act offered money to educational institutions and students and teachers to pursue careers in math, science, and engineering. Basically anything that would help America in the space race or defense industries, this educational bill is aimed at. Now, the United States would catch up and pass the Soviet Union in the space race. The United States launches its first satellite in January of 1958, and as we see in the 1960s, they do surpass the Soviet Union. In 1958, Eisenhower also faced another crisis, one in the Middle East, and then one more after that in Europe. In the Middle East, there was a coup that ousted the royal family in Iraq. Worried about the spread of Arab nationalism, Eisenhower sent the Marines to Lebanon in July of 1958 just to kind of have a presence in the region. Nothing really happened, and they were withdrawn in October of that year, so they're only there a few months. Later in Europe, in November of 1958, Khrushchev escalated tensions in Berlin. Khrushchev said that Berlin is the testicles of the West. He would say that all he'd have to do is squeeze, and he could make the West nervous. So he threatens to sign a treaty with East Germany if the American troops don't leave Berlin by May of 1959. So basically, if the treaty is signed between the Soviet Union and East Germany, then East Germany would refuse to allow American troops access to Berlin, which would cause another crisis about how to keep West Berlin secure. Eisenhower didn't overreact, and the date for the ultimatum came and went. The Soviet Union didn't end up signing a peace treaty with East Germany that would force American troops out of Berlin. Negotiations led to an agreement for Khrushchev to visit America and Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union. And so there's another real chance for a thaw in the Cold War. So Khrushchev is planning to come to America, and Eisenhower's planning to go to the Soviet Union. So to kind of set this up, in July of 1959, Nixon goes to Moscow, and he has something called the Kitchen Debate with Nikita Khrushchev. There's basically a exhibition of all this American stuff, like an American kitchen with, you know, a sink, dishwasher, refrigerator, ice chest, and Nixon shows Khrushchev, like, look how advanced America is. This is what the average American family can afford. And then they have this famous debate on TV. I want you to watch this clip.
Что-то ты выйдешь очень сердитый, вроде ты хочешь подраться. Ты не такой сердитый. That's right. Это когда-то он был кавалеристом тогда, а теперь он мирный человек.
Oh, yes. He still is. И вы до сих пор еще очень... Какое у вас пока общее впечатление выставки?
Если говорить впечатление, сейчас видно, что строители не успели закончить строительные свои дела, и экспонаты еще, так сказать, не находятся. Вот возможности Америка, сколько она существует лет уже? 300? 300 лет? 150 лет независимости. Вот мы тогда скажем, что Америка 150 лет, значит, существует, вот ее уровень. Мы 42 года еще не совершилось. Еще нам 7 лет, и мы будем на таком же уровне, как Америка. А в следующий пойдем дальше, вперед.
100 лет резерве остается у нас.
А?
100 лет резерве остается.
Но мы, когда вас обгоним на разъезде, мы вам приветствие такое любезное скажем. Потом, если хотите, мы можем остановиться и сказать, пожалуйста, за нами, пожалуйста. Вопрос социального устройства. Вы хотите при капитализме? Живите. Это дело ваше, это вопрос внутренний, нас не касается. Мы можем вам сочувствовать, ну что же, раз вы не понимаете, ну живите так, как понимаете.
Mr. Vice President, from what you have seen of our exhibition, how do you think it is going to impress the people of the Soviet Union?
It's a very effective exhibit, and it's one that will cause a great deal of interest. I might say that this morning, I very early in the morning went down to visit a market, and where the farmers from various outskirts of the city bring in their items to sell. I can only say that there was a great deal of interest among these people who were workers and farmers, etc. I would imagine that the exhibition from that standpoint will therefore be a considerable success. As far as Mr. Khrushchev's comments just now, they are in the tradition we learned to expect from him of speaking extemporaneously and frankly whenever he has an opportunity. I can only say that if this competition which you have just described so effectively, in which you plan to outstrip us, and particularly in the production of consumer goods, if this competition is to do the best for both of our peoples and for people everywhere, there must be a free exchange of ideas. There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit,
Мы в
you never
ракете вас
concede anything.
опередили, и в этой технике вас опередили. Американцы умные люди, мы всегда об этом верили и знали. Ну что, глупые люди не могли бы поднять экономику на такой уровень, которого не достигли. Но мы тоже, знаете, не мух, так сказать, ноздрями бьем. А за 42 года, знаете, так шагнули. Знаете, да. Что? Достойные партнеры.
You must not be afraid of ideas.
Вот мы вам говорим, вы-то не бойтесь идей, а нам бояться нечего. Мы уже вырвались из этого, понимаете, положения, когда нас идеи не пугают.
Yes. Well, then let's have more exchange of them. We all agree on that, right?
Хорошо. Вот. Что, с чем согласны?
Now let's go look at our picture.
Я согласен. Я хочу уточнить, с чем я согласен. Я имею право. Я же знаю, что я дело имею с хорошим адвокатом. Поэтому я хочу свою шахтерскую массу, так сказать, тоже, так сказать, чтобы поддержать на высоте. Чтобы шахтеры сказали, вот наш не уступает адвокату.
No question about that.
Вы адвокат капитализма, я адвокат коммунизма. Вот давайте мы посоревнуемся.
All that I can say from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation, you would have made a good lawyer yourself. But what I mean is this: here you can see the type of tape which will transmit this very conversation immediately. And this indicates the possibilities of increasing communication. And this increase in communication will teach us some things, and it will teach you some things too. Because after all, you don't know everything.
Если я не все знаю, так вы о коммунизме совсем ничего не знаете. Кроме страха у вас ничего нет.
If I don't know anything, then communism doesn't know anything except fear.
I don't think
If I don't know something, well, then you don't know anything about communism except fear.
Потом, сейчас мы диспут ведем не на равных основах. Аппарат ваш, вы говорите по-английски, я говорю по-русски. Ваши английские слова записаны и будут показаны, и услышат. А то, что я говорю, вам на ухо только переводит. И поэтому американский народ этого не будет слышать. Это неравные условия.
There isn't a day that goes by in the United States when we can't read everything that you say in the Soviet Union. And I can assure you that never make a statement here that you don't think we read in the United States.
Так вот, возьмите тогда, если так, я вас ловлю на... Поэтому я хочу, чтобы вы, вице-президент, что вы даете слово, что моя речь тоже будет записана на английском языке. Будет, нет?
Certainly it will. Certainly. Yes. Right, right. In fact, and by the same token, everything that I say will be recorded and translated and will be carried all over the Soviet Union. That's a fair bargain.
Все будет на русском языке. Мы деловые люди. Сразу сошлись.
Okay, so in September 1959, Khrushchev visits America. He travels throughout the country. He goes to places like Hollywood, and then he goes to an Iowa farm. So he's all over the place. Here's some clips of him on his trip.
This is Movietone. Jeffrey Sumner reporting. Visiting a plant in Des Moines, Iowa, Mr. Kay learnt the secrets of what goes into the hot dog, the ever-popular American speciality. Reports say he had to admit that America is ahead of Russia in sausage making. Obviously enjoying the visit, he also had a look at Iowa's corn growing and harvesting techniques. Some cattle on this farm at Coon Rapids were good evidence of the quality feed produced here. He was very interested in a mobile assembly line operation, a mechanized corn chopper that delivers the harvest to the silo all shucked and ready to eat. Iowa's in the heart of the Corn Belt. And he congratulated farmer Donald Watkins on his Corn Belt too. The last days of Mr. Khrushchev's tour were spent at Camp David, a short helicopter trip from Washington. The stay here was the crux of the whole tour. The Soviet premier had had a quick look at America, and now came the talks with President Eisenhower about the dangerous world problems dividing East and West. Well, as the world now knows, the visit ended with a joint statement. One important point being that negotiations on Berlin should be reopened. And it was agreed that all questions should be settled by negotiation, not by force. A full dress occasion.
He stayed for 13 days in the United States. Khrushchev was seeking something called peaceful coexistence with the United States. You know, under peaceful coexistence, the capitalist West and the communist East would coexist in the same world without solving their differences through conflict. Now, Khrushchev firmly believes that socialism would defeat capitalism someday, but we don't need to go to war to do it. Let's just let our two societies compete and socialism will win. Eisenhower and Khrushchev spent 3 of those days while he was in the United States at Camp David. They agreed to have a summit in Paris in May of 1960, so the following year they agreed to meet again, but that meeting gets derailed by the U-2 incident. The U-2 was a spy plane that the United States was using to spy on the Soviet Union. It was operated by the CIA. The Soviets had not been able to shoot it down, but they did know that these flights were taking place, and they were working on a way to shoot down the U-2 plane. The United States was developing its top secret satellite program called Corona that was supposed to replace the U-2s. So as the Soviet Union is getting closer to shooting them down, the United States is getting closer to ending the U-2 flights and replacing them with spy satellites. The CIA decided it needed one more mission over the Soviet Union in May of 1960, right before the Paris summit. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, took off from Pakistan, and he was going to fly over the Soviet Union and then land in Norway, but he was shot down over the Soviet Union. It was thought that the plane would be destroyed on impact and the pilot would be dead. He even had poison. If he survived, he was supposed to kill himself so as not to cause an international incident. But Khrushchev soon revealed on May 5th that he had shot down an American plane. He doesn't say what it is, but he blames the militarist at the Pentagon. That's who he says did it. Khrushchev is kind of providing a way for Eisenhower to deny that he knew this was happening. If he gives Eisenhower an out, then Khrushchev and Eisenhower can still have their meeting at Paris. There was an attempt in Washington to cover this up. You know, at one point they said it was a meteorological plane that had been flying in Turkey, and that the pilot, his oxygen mask had messed up and he had passed out, and maybe he accidentally flew into Soviet airspace and that's who they shot down. But days later, Khrushchev announced that he had the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive. He had captured him, and that he also had the wreckage of the U-2 plane. So basically, Khrushchev kind of gives Eisenhower a way out, but then when Eisenhower doesn't take the out, Khrushchev embarrasses him. Eisenhower ultimately accepts responsibility. He does not blame the U-2 incident on his subordinates. Some people wanted him to do that so he could have good relations with Khrushchev still, but Eisenhower said he hated the idea of deciding to do something and then it failing and then blaming someone else for it. So Eisenhower takes personal responsibility. At the Paris summit, Khrushchev demands an apology and he demands that the flight stop. Eisenhower refuses to meet Khrushchev's demands, and Khrushchev walks out of the Paris summit and cancels Eisenhower's trip to the Soviet Union. So basically, during the 1950s, Eisenhower and Khrushchev create better relations with each other, but then at the end of the 1950s, this incident kind of derails that. Now, Eisenhower, in January of 1961, he gives a farewell address to the nation. In his address, Eisenhower's theme was how the Cold War was changing America. You know, this is a whole new thing for America. After every war in American history, America demobilizes, the troops go home, defense spending goes down, and everybody goes back to civilian life. But after World War II, America kept their military, kept their nuclear missiles, you know, kept their presence overseas. So Eisenhower knows that the Cold War is radically changing American traditions, and he wants to tell the nation about that. He says, "Our military organization bears little relation to that known by any of my predecessors in peacetime. Until World War II, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could make swords as well. But now, because of the Cold War, we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend more on military security than the net income of all the United States corporations." So basically, previous wars, you didn't need an armaments industry, because if you think about like the Revolution, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, you're basically fighting those with rifles, machine guns. You know, you can teach men how to operate those, they can go fight. But now that you're in the Cold War, you have to have tanks and airplanes and nuclear missiles and submarines. Those are not things that you can just train a farmer to do. Back in the days of the American Revolution, a farmer could be a farmer. When the war came, the British came, he could pick up his musket, go fight. After the war, go back home. He didn't need to be a professional soldier to succeed against the British. But now in the ages of tanks and airplanes and nuclear weapons, you need professional soldiers that are trained with these things to win the war. So Eisenhower is kind of telling the nation this. Eisenhower continues, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new to the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, and even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. That's kind of the famous phrase from this speech, the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So Eisenhower warns the nation, don't let the military influence the country too much. Eisenhower then says that America must, quote, avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. So that's kind of the Eisenhower years. Next, we'll kind of see what Kennedy does as president.
From the White House in the office of the President of the United States, we present an address by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the farewell address for President Eisenhower, whose 8 years as chief executive come to an end at noon Friday. Mr. Eisenhower has chosen this time for his final speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. First, I should like to express my gratitude to the radio and television networks for the opportunities they have given me over the years to bring reports and messages to our nation. My special thanks go to them for the opportunity of addressing you this evening. 3 days from now, after half a century in the service of our country, I shall lay down the responsibilities of office as, in traditional and solemn ceremony, the authority of the presidency is vested in my successor. This evening, I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. Like every other citizen, I wish the new president and all who will labor with him Godspeed. I pray that the coming years will be blessed with peace and prosperity for all. Our people expect their president and the Congress to find essential agreement on issues of great moment, the wise resolution of which will better shape the future of the nation. My own relations with the Congress, which began on a remote and tenuous basis when, long ago, a member of the Senate appointed me to West Point, have since ranged to the intimate during the war and immediate post-war period, and finally to the mutually interdependent during these past 8 years. In this final relationship, the Congress and the administration have, on most vital issues, cooperated well to serve the nation good rather than mere partisanship, and so have assured that the business of the nation should go forward. So my official relationship with the Congress ends in a feeling, on my part, of gratitude that we have been able to do so much together. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Despite these holocausts, America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. Throughout America's adventure in free government, our basic purposes have been to keep the peace, to foster progress in human achievement, and to enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and among nations. To strive for less would be unworthy of a free and religious people. Any failure traceable to arrogance or our lack of comprehension or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty the stake. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human betterment. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy. Balance between the cost and hoped for advantages. Balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable. Balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual. Balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. Good judgment seeks balance and progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. The record of many decades stands as proof that our people and their government have, in the main, understood these truths and have responded to them well in the face of threat and stress. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise. Of these I mention two only. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. During the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Such a confederation must be one of equals. The weakest must come to the conference table with the same confidence as do we, protected as we are by our moral, economic, and military strength. That table, though scarred by many past frustrations, cannot be abandoned for the certainty agony of disarmament of the battlefield. Disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative. Together we must learn how to compose differences, not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Because this need is so sharp and apparent, I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Happily, I can say that war has been avoided. Steady progress toward our ultimate goal has been made, but so much remains to be done. As a private citizen, I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road. So in this, my last good night to you as your president, I thank you for the many opportunities you have given me for public service in war and in peace. I trust in that service, you find some things worthy. As for the rest of it, I know you will find ways to improve performance in the future. You and I, my fellow citizens, need to be strong in our faith that all nations under God will reach the goal of peace with justice. May we be ever unswerving in devotion to principle, confident but humble with power, diligent in pursuit of the nation's great goals. To all the peoples of the world, I once more give expression to America's prayerful and continuing aspiration. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility, that all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth, and that in the goodness of time all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love. Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
We have presented the farewell address by the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who spoke this evening from his office in the White House.